Last weekend, Syrians enjoyed a long-delayed celebration of the anniversary of the beginning of their revolution. On March 15th, 2011, the Arab Spring sprung in Syria. Demonstrators marched in Damascus, Aleppo and elsewhere, demanding an end to, at the very least, a reform of the 4-decade tyranny imposed by 2 generations of Assad, Hafez, then Bashar. What they got was disaster. A brutal crackdown by the Assad regime prompted a multi-way civil war, which escalated into an all-in brawl involving the forces, allies and proxies of Iran, Turkey, Russia, the United States and Israel, among many others, to say nothing of various Kurdish militias, assorted al-Qaeda affiliates, sundry jihadist groups, and the grim phenomenon of Islamic State, which at one point controlled roughly a third of the country. Nobody really knows how many of Syria's pre-war population of 23 million were consumed by this mayhem, but there is not an estimate which does not run into the hundreds of thousands. More than 14 million people were displaced, of whom roughly half fled abroad. The unloading of President Bashar al-Assad in December was, therefore, a hopeful moment. The installation of his successor, jihadist commander Ahmed al-Sharaa, a more nervous one. Optimism is understandable, doubt reasonable. Earlier this month, perhaps 1,000 civilians, mostly members of the Alawite minority to which the Assads belonged, were massacred by forces loyal to al-Sharaa. Is Syria's nightmare really over? Will its neighbours now leave it alone for a change? Can Syria really be put back together again? This is the Foreign Desk.
As soon as the plane hit the tarmac in Damascus, people started singing. Some people were crying for House of Joy. One old man started shouting, congratulations to all of us, we're back, Assad's gone.
People now are out of this prison, and it's really hard to put them back.
I don't think they're going to get this kind of pristine, laboratory in which they're going to rebuild their country from scratch. Instead, I think they're going to be operating in this kind of geopolitical cauldron of all these players nipping at it in different directions.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, who visited Syria in February. Hannah, let's start with basic logistics, because travelling to a country where the regime has just changed or is changing is always a fairly uncertain prospect. How did you actually get there?
Well, here's one of the really sort of amazing things as a journalist who's covered Syria for more than a decade. Getting into Syria was always the problem. And for most journalists, myself included, because we'd reported in rebel-held areas, we were basically blacklisted from Damascus. We couldn't go. Syria was very, very tightly controlled. Even before the outbreak of the revolution in 2011, it was quite hard to get a visa, very, very tightly controlled. And then all of a sudden, after Assad fled the country, not the borders were flung open, I won't go that far, but suddenly it became one of the easiest places to get access to as a journalist. So they have a press system up and running already, the new administration in Damascus. I applied for my press visa and 2 days later it arrived. And then I got on a plane from Istanbul to Damascus. And that in itself is extraordinary because those flights hadn't been running since 2011. In fact, the diplomatic relations between Turkey and Syria were completely cut. So not only as a journalist was I not able to go to Damascus, but certainly you would not be able to fly from Istanbul to Damascus. And as we were boarding the plane in Istanbul, most of that plane was Syrians returning home for the first time, and they were all getting their phones out and taking a photo of the screen above the desks as we went to board the plane.
Well, what was the atmosphere like on board, though? I mean, obviously many millions of Syrians had fled Syria, and a great many of those had ended up in Turkey. Was it pure excitement among the other passengers? Was there also an amount of trepidation about what might await them?
I have to say, I've never seen such a reaction when I've landed anywhere. As soon as the plane hit the tarmac in Damascus, people started singing. Some people were crying for House of Joy. People were applauding as we came out and came down onto the tarmac. One old man started shouting, congratulations to all of us. We're back. Assad's gone. Some people were sort of kneeling down and touching the ground. It was really, really emotional. And then when we got into the airport terminal, it was absolutely packed with people waiting for their loved ones. And just the scenes of pure joy and celebration were really, really quite affecting to see.
Well, once you got out of the airport and into Damascus and started going out and about, what did that feel like? Because that moment when everything is in flux in a capital city in particular can be extremely peculiar, because however relieved people may be at the ousting of the former regime, nobody yet really understands entirely who is in charge.
Yeah, I would say there was a lot of joy. The last time that I was in Damascus was in February 2011, when the protests were first kicking off. And of course, at that time, Syria generally was a really, really tough police state. You could not talk about anything, but particularly at that time, you could almost tangibly feel the fear on the streets. And of course, the image of Bashar al-Assad was just absolutely everywhere, every public building, almost every shop. People felt that they had to sort of put a picture of him up, or his father, Hafez al-Assad. And now every single one of those pictures has been defaced or torn down. I think there was a sense of sort of anarchic freedom. People are making jokes everywhere. You go into the souk and you find like these pairs of socks with Bashar's face on it. When you come out of the airport, they've put a rug down so you can walk over his face. So it's like all this, bottled up jokes and things that people have wanted to say, not just for the past 14 years, but for 54 years. Let's not forget how long this regime was in place. But as well as that, there was also a sense of trepidation for two reasons. First of all, of course, the new leaders. Who are they exactly? We know that they had their roots in al-Qaeda. Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president of the country, he initially went to Iraq in 2003 to join the jihad there, spent some time in prisons, and then came back and founded al-Qaeda's franchise in Syria, who did some really brutal, extreme things, including repression of minorities. Now, Sharaa, over the past 5 years, has gone on this drive to reform and to present himself as a leader who can represent all of Syria, but also who can deal with the outside world. And he's certainly, really making that effort since December. We've seen him donning a suit, meeting European leaders. But at the same time, not surprisingly, many people in Damascus, not just the minorities, but also Sunni Muslims who live sort of non-conservative lives, who don't want to abide by strict Sharia law, are very, very concerned. They're saying, okay, is this a case like in Afghanistan in 2021 when the Taliban first came in and they promised all these things, but actually when they didn't get what they wanted, which was sanctions lifted and a place at the UN, then they just retreated to being who they actually are? Is it a case of that, or is it a case that Sharia is smarter than that, is honest to his word, and is genuinely going to reform? The second thing that people are worried about is the economy. And, it's incredibly difficult for Syrians. It's a kind of daily grind. And, what everyone was saying was, okay, there's the political aspect of this, but really the thing that affects the people and what everybody wants is just for those sanctions to be lifted and for the Syrian economy to kind of start rebooting.
But just among Syrians you spoke to, how much faith was there still in the idea of Syria as a coherent political construct? Because obviously during this decade and a bit of war, it has been dismantled into any number of chunks by various players in its conflict. And obviously we've seen something of the tensions that may exist in that sectarian violence that has erupted since your visit. Were people really confident in and indeed interested in the idea of Syria as being this coherent nation from here on?
Nobody can deny the level of sectarianism in Syria, and that's not just something that came about during the war. The entire system that the Assad family built was based on this kind of divide and rule politics. It's saying to the minorities, we're going to protect you against the Sunni Muslim majority. Only we can do that. Look, they're just kind of terrorists in waiting. And then, of course, once the war broke out, that was the narrative. And what happened shortly after I returned from Damascus in the coastal regions was perhaps a sign that this is going to be the most difficult thing to overcome. But I think on the positive side, Syrians are thoroughly sick of war. This is what everybody said. They said, all we want is to live in peace, to get on with our lives. The other thing that Syria really, really needs, if it's going to move past all the things that happened during the war, and let's not forget, all sides committed atrocities. And what we saw, unfortunately, a few weeks ago was what appears to be revenge attacks against the Alawite minority, which is Assad's sect. What really needs to happen is a process of truth and reconciliation. And the question is, how can that happen? Because you have a completely destroyed state, and the new transitional government has to build it up piece by piece. It's having to sort of, decide what its priorities are. It's obviously, really got stuck in there with building the foreign ministry back up. It's sort of getting there with, trade ministry and things like that. But with the justice system, it's going to be really difficult. And I think the question is, how is that going to work? Is there going to be some kind of international court that's going to come in and deal with the question of, prosecuting war crimes? Is it something that Syrians want to do themselves? But whatever way, that process has to happen before the country can move on.
Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent, thank you for joining us. You can read Hannah's full report from Syria in Monocle's April issue, which is on a newsstand near you on Thursday. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. As we shall shortly be hearing, many other countries are invested in what sort of country Syria may become, but none of them more so than actual Syrians, many of whom assumed until recently that there was no future for them at home. And joining me now is the Syrian journalist Zaina Erhaim. Zaina, first of all, to start with a broad question, how optimistic are you feeling?
Well, personally, I'm not a very optimistic person. And I think it's about being a feminist and seeing the intersectional kind of oppression on people. So I always see those who are most oppressed, which makes me a bit less optimistic. However, there are many incidents that are being reported across Syria that kind of force us to be optimistic, like what happened yesterday with the Nowruz celebration for the first time ever in Damascus, where Kurds were actually been able to go to the streets, lit their fire and dance. Seeing such things cannot really make you but a little bit optimistic.
I mean, you have the experience of having lived under the rule of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS, the current interim government of Syria, when they were at large in your hometown in Idlib early on in Syria's war. What was that like? And I guess, is there any indication there that you see that the way they were then is the way they still are now?
Well, according to those who stayed after I left, everything has changed. And I think they are not as, for all armed people, they are not as focused on one specific area. Now they have the whole Syria. There are plenty of security concerns that they have to deal with instead of interfering with people's personal freedom as they used to be doing in Idlib, for example. And one of the things that I noticed with someone I know who used to be a member in one of the armed groups, he told me after going to Damascus and for the first time seeing different people that we were not able to communicate or be in touch with, my mind has changed. Now I don't see an unveiled woman as a very strange thing to be seen. So I think this access to others that they didn't have before is affecting either the junior fighters who literally have been living in this ghetto where everything is so closed. They are not seeing anyone who is different, especially those very young ones. So the niece of my friend, he is 15 years old and he hasn't seen an unveiled woman in his life. So now having the chance to see other Syrians, I think this is one of the things that is going to be changing the things.
I mean, you are among those Syrian exiles who was able to go back after Assad fell, and you wrote about this, and I recommend listeners looking that up. But can you give us some idea of what that was like? What about it, I guess, surprised you, and what might have given you some grounds for optimism?
Well, I wasn't that much surprised, but everything looked very weird. I think one of the elements that was really sad is how spread the poverty is. I haven't seen people begging in the streets so much in my life, and Syria wasn't like this. Even in the rebel-held areas under barrel bombs, there was no such a level of poverty. And I didn't also recognize how much the Syrian regime has actually literally sucked the people out of their money with the bribes on the checkpoints, with things that they need to pay to literally do anything in their life as passing a checkpoint. So that was a surprise. Also, things haven't changed at all. There was no nail that literally has been rehabilitated in a building. Nothing was clean. It was left as it is. I mean, even if Assad was dealing with Syria as his own farm, he would have taken care of it to be sustainable a bit more. So that was something that was really sad for me. But what was lovely is the interaction of regular people in the streets. So lots of interactions with people who are feeding cats, because I'm a cat lady. People speaking about alternative way that they created to feed the street cats because everything is so expensive. And this kind of community that's not a community, how much people are eager to speak, even taxi drivers. And for the first time, we're not scared, because generally taxi drivers under regime control used to be security forces and they want to take some information to report you. So people were free. In many of the taxis, many of them were criticizing the current interim government. They were speaking against the interim president. I mean, things that are very much unusual. And I think this is one of the things that would also give you some hope that people now are out of this prison, and it's really hard to put them back.
I mean, are you concerned, though, that at least half the population, by which I mean Syria's women, might be in danger of being put back into some sort of prison? This is always, I think, unfortunately ends up being the most useful test of former jihadists who arrive in power and want to try and reposition themselves, is how they actually do treat women once they're in a position to make decisions about that.
I mean, it's two elements, in my opinion. First, armed men are organically against women, and then extremist men are also organically against women. So having those two in power is certainly not in the women's favor. But I believe that oppressing women, as what happened in northern Syria under the different rebels' control, is not possible across Syria. It's not just a wider geography, but there are lots of rebellious women and very courageous ones who wouldn't accept to do so. In the north, there were few, but there were not so many to be able to resist that. And despite this, they kept working and they kept challenging the previous role. Also, the diversity. Now we have women from different backgrounds, different social backgrounds, different classes. I think the diversity is something that is challenging for the government, and they wouldn't be able to oppress it as the groups did in the north. I mean, I was speaking with a friend who is still in Damascus now. I was telling her, if women were able to just push the men out of the scene for 2 days, I think Syria could be cleaned, tolerance, and things would be really fixed, even if like mothers force their kids to deliver their weapons back. And I think they will be doing so, if not today, tomorrow.
I guess just finally, and it's an extension of the question we started with about optimism, and thinking not maybe of the immediate future, which is likely to be difficult, but if you think of what Syria might be like 5-10 years from now, what strikes you as a best case scenario?
Well, I'm almost 40. I've never voted in my life yet. Not on anything, not even in schools. I mean, being able to be part of this process looks like a wild dream, but I mean, going back to Damascus was also a wild dream, and it happened. I believe if the civil society were able to gain more space and implement all the work that they've been doing for the last 14 years, if women were given the space to take their role, and enforce themselves within the political scene, economical scene, and all the other scenes in Syria, we will definitely seeing a more stable Syria, a more secure, and I really hope it's going to be united and inclusive.
That was the Syrian journalist Zaina Erhaim. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Since Bashar al-Assad was toppled last December, there has been a steady stream of international visitors to Syria attempting to get the measure of the new regime. One of them was Slovenia's Foreign Minister, Tanja Fajon. We spoke to her at the Munich Security Conference in February, shortly after she had returned from Damascus and before the apparent pogroms against Alawite civilians. I began by asking if she was buying interim President Ahmed al-Shara's apparent conversion from rifle-brandishing jihadist to suit-wearing Democrat.
I had a long discussion in the palace in Damascus with the interim president, and I really believe we have to give a chance. There is a change, there is an opportunity, but it's up to this interim president and the interim authorities. I also spoke with the foreign minister, how they will manage to make this political transition a truly inclusive one, meaning how to include religious, ethnic minorities, vulnerable groups, including women. And that was also my message to the interim president. We expect a political transition that will be a very inclusive one. I think there is a general awareness that it is an opportunity. It will be not an easy one. There is still a question of the southeast of the country. There are still negotiations how really to include Kurds and how to have a control and really stability and inclusive process. But on the other hand, I think we also have to be aware that Syria currently needs some push from the international community. We have sanctions, American sanctions, European sanctions. Slovenia also supported on the EU level that we are gradually lifting the sanctions, but monitoring at the same time situation on the ground. So it will not be an easy process, but I think people there discussing, talking to them, Syrians are, I would say, cautiously optimistic.
Did you get a sense, though, of what the best approach from Western countries, Europe, the United States, might be in terms of trying to shape this in a positive direction? Is it going to be active involvement, or, given recent history and the record of the Western world in trying to shape events in the Middle East, staying out of it and let the Syrians sort it out? I
mean, we have a conference in March, EU-Syria in Brussels, and I think there will be certainly a European active involvement. We need to support also when it comes to reconstruction, building public institutions and the system in the country. From banking on, everything has to be basically done from the scratch. So looking what are the contacts of the interim president and how much they are really going around building the allies, not only in the Middle East or within Gulf countries, but also with Lebanon or European countries, France, Italy, discussing with Trump. I think they really want to position themselves and they want to build the credibility. So once again, I say we have to give them opportunity.
I mean, do you perceive, and this is a horribly fate-tempting question, so I'm kind of apologising in advance, that this might actually be kind of a hopeful moment for the Middle East, in between the removal of Assad, the decapitation of Hezbollah, the retraction of Iran, certainly the diminishment of Hamas? Is there a space there in which something better can be built?
I do hope. We are following a very fragile ceasefire and rebuilding of the institutions and the state. We see also a very fragile ceasefire and a sign of hope in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we just got a new government. I met also in Lebanon, at that time still a designated prime minister who used to be leader of the ICJ court, so very committed to the justice and the rule of law. And we have there a Lebanon president. So let's see, it's a fragile ceasefire with a president gives a lot of hope to rebuild the country. Also something that we have to closely monitor. But let's say Lebanon, Syria, some positive developments.
That was Tanja Fajon, Foreign Minister of Slovenia. This is The Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Syria's war was not just a civil war. In one way or another, it involved dozens of other countries, but most intimately, Syria's neighbours. What do they want now? Our final guest is Faysal Itani, Senior Director of Middle East Programmes at the New Lines Institute and an Adjunct Professor of Middle Eastern Politics at Georgetown University. Faysal, let's start with Lebanon, which is more or less surrounded by Syria. Does Lebanon's new government appear to have a particular view on Syria's new government?
Not particularly, no. Lebanon's government itself has been elected from outside of the usual political elite and political circles. It's got a very technocratic mindset to tackling the many governance problems of Lebanon. The one that will be more linked to Syria is you've got a couple that are intimately linked. The 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and of course Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon, which remains very heavily armed and dangerous. So the Lebanese government as such doesn't have a plan. The Lebanese security forces do, and that's mostly about border security and keeping like Sunni jihadi militants from Syria out of Lebanon. And that's basically the parameters of it.
On the subject of Hezbollah in particular, though, obviously they may have lost a major patron in Bashar al-Assad and a sanctuary in Syria. Does that potentially make them actually more dangerous in Lebanon, despite their sort of recent considerable losses in the war with Israel? Does it mean that they might refocus themselves on re-establishing themselves in Lebanon?
My answer is a little bit complicated. The party itself is weakened. However, the ways in which it's weakened don't prevent it from being a danger in Lebanon. So it's lost its kind of larger arsenal. A lot of its leadership is gone. They're demoralized, obviously. They're on the rear. They're fighting a defensive position, but they can still do a lot of harm to other Lebanese. They have tens of thousands of small arms. They're still the most dangerous group in the country. And so to what extent they exercise that power, I think depends on what their rivals do. If their adversaries in Lebanon, and they have many, perceive that Hezbollah's on the back foot, let's get at them now. Let's take away their weaponry. Let's land that blow now that we have a chance to do it. They're going to fight back and very hard. However, if people leave them alone more or less to kind of nurse their wounds and come back to life, they would rather do that than be picking fights with other Lebanese factions, in my opinion.
Well, just finally on Lebanon, because obviously it's an extremely complex relationship between Lebanon and Syria, which by itself could occupy several entire episodes of this program. But it kind of boils down to one fundamental question, which is that, is there any hope at all, do you think, that Syria might just leave Lebanon alone for a change?
This is a great question. I actually wrote a piece about this, an analytical piece, a couple of months ago. I think that they're too busy for the Lebanese at the moment, and that they have to consolidate power in their own country. We saw the Syrian regime under Assad go from, fully control of Lebanon to as well fighting its own problems, its own challenges. I think that so far as Syria remains fragmented, poor, dangerous, then the central Syrian government will not have time for Lebanon. There are, however, factions in Syria that could create problems in Lebanon. They may already have begun to do so in conjunction with Hezbollah. Long term, I think the only safe bet for Lebanon from Syria is that Syria be a stable and democratic country. Any other permutation, I think, will intervene in Lebanon different ways to the advantage of different players, depending on the sect that controls Syria, depending on their ideology. But I don't see Lebanon being outside of that orbit unless Syria's government looks a certain way.
Well, let's take a look at how Turkey might see this. Does it regard the new regime in Syria as explicitly a Turkish ally? And would that perhaps be a naive judgment of theirs?
I think they look at it in a kind of patrimonial sense, as an offspring as much as anything else, not as an equal. Turkey is a kind of regional geopolitical heavyweight, is not going to see a militia as being its partner or its colleague, but they do see them as a product of Turkey, as a product of Turkish foreign policy. And as long as they remain a little bit restrained on the kind of hardcore ideological front. I think Turkey's likely to see them as an asset for sure. There are some divergences and some liabilities. There is some divergence over the Kurdish issue and how exactly Turkey should handle that. And there's also the Israel problem, which has created a serious problem for Turkey as well, and a problem for the government in Damascus, but of a slightly different kind.
I'll come to Israel shortly, but you mentioned there the Kurdish factor here, and obviously this is a long-standing concern of Turkey's. It's one of the reasons Turkey got involved in Syria's war in the first place. Is it clear whether or not Damascus and Ankara actually want the same thing? Would, for example, Erdogan be content with the idea of there being an autonomous Kurdish presence in Syria, perhaps similar to the one that the Kurds have in Iraq?
Yeah, this is a very complicated matter because there is more than one thing going on at the same time. First of all, there is Turkey wanting to contain the SDF, the Syrian faction in Syria, as much as possible, and give it as least autonomy as possible, which isn't to say zero, just to be realistic, but as least as possible. They also have their own peace track going on with their 40-year diehard enemy, the PKK, of which the SDF was originally an offshoot, and they want that to move forward. So they want peace on that front. That would have multiple political dividends for Erdogan, as well as for Turkish security at large. The man sitting in Damascus has a different problem on his hands. That man has to consolidate authority in the country and bring people or factions broadly under the umbrella of Damascus. And they have to do that with the SDF. The SDF has American military support, maybe not forever, but it's still a very powerful faction. And Ahmed al-Sharaa has enough problems. So for him, he needs to tone down this conflict quickly, as long as there isn't total Kurdish autonomy or independence or whatever. So these three things happening at the same time, it's hard to align them perfectly. And I think we're going to see this kind of clumsy little marathon playing out over the next few months.
Well, one of the factors which may hinder the new Syrian regime's ability to act in any direction is that it is rapidly running out of military equipment. And this brings us to the question of Israel, which obviously launched massive airstrikes immediately following the fall of Assad to pretty much destroy any Syrian military equipment they could find. We've seen further airstrikes by Israel as recently as this week, hitting former Syrian army positions in Homs province and I think further south as well. Is it clear what Israel actually does want? They are presumably not unhappy to have seen the back of Assad.
Yes, it's a tricky one because on the one hand, you would think that a hostile Assad regime, at least on paper hostile, backed by the Iranians who've infiltrated the country, will be worse than any of the alternatives for, at least most of the alternatives for Israel. But it turns out that this isn't the case. And we can see that from their behavior since the fall of the Assad regime. The Assad regime was largely peaceful towards the Israelis. It sounds weird, but it's true. And the Iranian thing was under control through direct Israeli military action. For the Israelis, the worst possible scenario is that there be a relatively popular, relatively capable Sunni Islamist regime enjoying some regional support in Damascus with a military that you can speak of. On its borders, in control of the entire country. So this is the worst case scenario. The better case scenario is that the country stays fragmented, that the regime in Damascus stays basically on the defensive, that they have very little military capability to speak of outside of kind of domestic conflict. And that's the scenario the Israelis are going for. I mean, whether that is indeed in their best interest or not is debatable, but I think this is how they see the better.
Well, which does rather seamlessly bring us along to Iran, and obviously it was Syria's status as an Iranian proxy, a staging ground for Hezbollah that Israel perceived as a threat, probably not entirely without reason. It has been generally assessed that the fall of Assad is bad news for Iran, that the new regime won't be as interested in dealing with Tehran. Is it likely, though, that Iran has altogether just given up on Syria, realised that, oh, well, you can't win them all, let's concentrate our energies elsewhere?
No, I don't think this has happened because, so look at the Iranian assets in play. You have them in Yemen, where they're taking a pounding. And anyway, they were never as capable as something like Hezbollah. You have Iraq, which, of course, is still largely in the Iranian sphere of influence, but also a complicated environment. The crown jewel was Hezbollah, and that meant also Syria, etc. I think we can do away with the idea that we have some kind of Iranian crescent, that's in control of the Levant and Iran and Iraq. That's obviously gone. I think it'll be very hard to restore it, but it's a lot easier to make problems for other people than it is to rule places. And I think they can go after this very vulnerable Syrian government by provoking it in very small ways that actually have an outsized impact. Of course, you're aware of what happened a couple of weeks ago in the northwest provinces of Syria, where you had a very localized fight with a few hundred casualties turn into really like a geopolitical international catastrophe for the government in Damascus. And it just goes to show you don't have to put a lot of resources and effort into making problems. Now, I don't know that that was the Iranians or it wasn't, maybe it wasn't. But I think it demonstrates how vulnerable this whole situation is. And I think for the Iranians, what they're going to want to do in Lebanon and Syria is make sure that they don't lose all their equities. Their most important equity is in Lebanon, where they have substantial support too among a portion of the population. Syria is more difficult, more hostile, but also more broken and more vulnerable. So they have some options to create problems. I don't think they're going to give up on it. I wouldn't if I was them, because they still have some assets in play that they can mess around with. But it's a tough one too for them. I'm not going to exaggerate. It's a very hostile, unforgivable environment, but they can still make problems. Yeah.
Well, just finally then, we started out this chat talking about whether or not Syria would ever leave Lebanon alone. Is it fair to say in sum that there is almost no chance everybody else is going to leave Syria alone?
Yeah, I think there's too much at stake here. And I don't think there is I think the only people who are kind of leaving it alone while providing some money and effort are some European countries. But I think everybody else, this is such a high stakes place. Just look at the map. That's all you need to see, right? This geography and demographics. The Lebanese don't have time to go around making problems for other people. The Turks have won a big victory, but it's very, very hard to hold. But then you have the Jordanian. We haven't talked about, Jordan, Egypt, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia. Everybody has an opinion about what should happen to this place. So no, I don't think they're going to get this kind of pristine, laboratory in which they're going to rebuild their country from scratch. I think that's what they need, but I'm not sure they're going to get it. Instead, I think they're going to be operating in this kind of geopolitical cauldron of all these players nipping at it in different directions. That's why I'm a little bit skeptical about what happens next, to be honest.
Faysal Itani at the New Lines Institute, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.